This is GCSE Bite-Size Revision Unit 2, Germany 1918 to 1939. This is bite-size revision designed to help you get through the topics gradually. Section 1, Part 2, it's the Weimar Constitution. So the Weimar Constitution, basically, it was the German government after World War I. And the way to think about the Weimar Constitution is dead simple. Just think about it in terms of what's good about it, what's not, i.e. its strengths and its weaknesses. Its strengths are really what's good about it in theory. So in theory, it was designed to be more democratic. It should have power spread out rather than having just one person in charge. So on the right you can see the old Kaiser, and rather than having him in charge, okay, it's not one person anymore, there's many different peoples and groups of peoples. However, the weaknesses are the things that happen in practice. So basically things like often the person at the top had to resort to using emergency powers. So it would be a bit like, might as well have the Kaiser back again. Too many parties represented meant it took too long to make decisions. So that's why you can see a waiting room on the right, because essentially people had to wait around for ages to get anything done. And then that's why emergency laws were kept being passed. Structure of the Weimar Constitution, otherwise known as the Weimar Government or the Weimar Republic, the easy way to remember it is PCRP. Basically, if that's not memorable enough, it's a sentence. The president couldn't rule properly, which is basically true. That stands for the different positions in the Weimar government. So if you were to get a key features question about the structure of the Weimar government, you could just remember the president couldn't rule properly, and that stands for P, the president, C, the Chancellor, R, the Reichstag, and P, the people. The Weimar Constitution itself, just giving you a little bit more detail here, at the bottom you've got two boxes. So one, the green one is the key strength, and the yellow one, the key weaknesses. And essentially there's one key strength, and basically that's what it should do in theory, and there's two key weaknesses, two key aspects about what in practice just does not work. So the key strength is the fact that it was more democratic. The government was designed in theory to be fairer and more representative than under Wilhelm II. So the idea is you've got different people in charge of different sections. I'm just going to go through those with you. Remembering the PCRP, the president couldn't rule properly. So P stands for president. President's at the top. He's elected every 7 years by the people. So even though he's right at the top, he actually doesn't have all the power. The people give him the power. Underneath him, you've got the Chancellor and the ministers. The Chancellor, remember this is the C part of the PCRP, was appointed by the President, and they didn't have complete control either, because even though they were in charge of passing laws, they needed the Reichstag's support in order to do so. So that's the next section, the Reichstag. That's the R part of the PCRP. The Reichstag was like the Parliament, so essentially it was a group of different groups of people who'd been elected by the people every 4 years, and they had to agree with each other to pass laws. So you've got loads of different groups of people contributing. And then finally, the last P of the PCRP is the German people. Essentially, the Weimar Constitution was supposed to be people's government. The idea was they chose the highest part, the president, they chose the Reichstag, the people who passed the laws. So in theory, it was supposed to be much more fairer and representative. However, moving on to the weaknesses, remember we said in practice there was two weaknesses. First weakness, problem is the president, even though he's elected by the people and so on, if he chooses to do so, he can call a state of emergency and then just basically suspend all rights, suspend the rest of the constitution and override everything and pass laws. So it's called Article 4018 quote. So if essentially there's a state of emergency as judged by the president, he can then just go ahead and act basically like a Kaiser, like a dictator. This isn't great because this obviously suggests that you've reverted back to the old style. Even worse, this power was used so many times between 1918 and 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor that the constitution obviously wasn't working. Why was he having to declare a state of emergency all the time if the constitution was working? This brings us on to the next key weakness, which is the idea of proportional representation. Sounds great in theory, you've got everybody represented, but in the Reichstag, if you've got even lots of different small parties all gaining seats, it's going to be really difficult for the Chancellor to get all 28, in this case, parties to agree so we can pass a law. because in order to pass a law, you've got to get over 50% of the Reichstag agreeing. But if it's divided into so many tiny little different parties, you've got to get them to agree with each other. And there was loads of different reviews going around at the time. So really you can see that this feeds into the formal weakness, the idea that the president used Article 48, because he couldn't stand to wait. He had to keep waiting. And if there's a situation in Germany that needs attention and the Reichstag can't make decisions, the president felt he had no choice but to override it. So, in summary, in theory it sounded great, in practice it was pretty rubbish. In some ways you could say the Weimar Constitution was on very shaky ground and it was doomed to fail. Right, moving on to exam practice about the Weimar government. This is so simple, honestly. If you remember the PCRP, you're laughing. Here is a 6-mark question, a classic one. Describe the key features of the Weimar Constitution. Just go through PCRP. Remember, the president couldn't rule properly. What does it stand for again? P, President, C, Chancellor, R, Reichstag, P, People. You go through each one in turn, explain what role they had to play, and then talk about the strengths and the weaknesses. Remember, there's one strength and there's 2 weaknesses. The main strength is in theory it should be more democratic. The 2 weaknesses is in practice, actually Article 48 was used too much and proportional representation meant people had to wait. Easy peasy. Here we go, here's the second one. Describe how the Weimar government was governed. It's pretty much the same question as the first one, and you just do exactly the same thing. So PCRP, strengths and weaknesses. In fact, this is so easy, I challenge you, 10 minutes, go ahead and do one. Choose one. Go on, go ahead, go write it. Afterwards, get yourself a nice cup of tea and a chocolate biscuit. Yum, yum, yum.